while their citizens begged for clean water. And something inside him broke. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. He began reading the speeches of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary icon who once led Burkina Faso with fire and vision. Sankara had been assassinated, but his ideas lived on. Traoré absorbed them like scripture. Sovereignty, self-reliance, Pan-African unity. He started speaking differently, acting differently, refusing to participate in ceremonies that felt colonial, questioning orders that served foreign agendas. His peers called him bold. His superiors called him dangerous. But the people called him something else, necessary. When the government faltered, when corruption became unbearable, Traoré didn't wait for permission. He led a coup, not for power, but for possibility. And when he took office, he didn't sit behind bulletproof glass. He walked among the people. He listened. He promised change. Then he delivered. He expelled French troops. He shut down foreign propaganda outlets. He called for African nations to unite, not in theory, but in practice. And he did it all with a calm that unnerved the elite. Because Traoré wasn't just rejecting colonial influence. He was rejecting fear. He knew the risks. He knew the threats. But he also knew the stakes. This wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about every African child who had been told to wait, every village that had been ignored, every voice that had been silenced. And that's why, when the secret meeting leaked, Traoré didn't flinch. He struck back. The leak hit like thunder. Within hours of whispers escaping the walls of Abidjan, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowd in Ouagadougou. No teleprompter, no script, just fire. His voice was calm, but his words cut deep. They met in secret, he said, eyes locked on the lens. Not to serve Africa, but to silence it. The crowd erupted. Online, the clip spread like wildfire. TikTok edits layered his speech over drums and defiant beats. Twitter lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Traoré Unfiltered. Hashtag AfricanBot. The youth weren't just watching, they were echoing. Then came the expulsions. First, the French troops. Traoré gave them days to leave. No negotiation, no ceremony, just a firm declaration. Burkina Faso will no longer host foreign armies that do not serve its people. Next, the media. State-run outlets tied to foreign interests were shut down. Their offices emptied, their signals cut. In their place, local journalists stepped forward, raw, unpolished, but finally free. Then the airlines. French carriers were banned from Burkinabe airspace. It wasn't just symbolic. It was surgical. A message to the world. Sovereignty isn't a slogan. It's policy. The elite scrambled. In Abidjan, phones rang off the hook. Statements were drafted, then redrafted. Some leaders denied the meeting ever happened. Others called for regional stability. But none could match Traoré's clarity. He didn't flinch. He didn't waver. He stood taller. In one viral moment, he walked through a market surrounded by ordinary citizens. No guards, no mouterkath, just a man among his people. A child handed him a drawing, a map of Africa with Burkina Faso glowing at its center. He smiled. "We are not alone," he said, "and we are not afraid." That clip became legend. Commentators tried to spin it. Analysts tried to dissect it. But the truth was simple. Traoré had turned their secret plot into a public reckoning. And yet, even as the world watched, even as the elite scrambled to contain the fallout, Traoré remained quiet about one thing: the move he was preparing behind the scenes. Because the real counterattack was still coming, and it would shake the continent. The sun hadn't yet risen when the announcement came. A single tweet from Burkina Faso's official account. No fanfare, no warning, just a flag, 3 stars, 3 nations, 1 alliance. Within minutes, the world was awake. Ibrahim Traoré had done what no summit, no diplomat, no foreign envoy had dared. He united Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso into a new political and military bloc, the Alliance of Sahel States. It wasn't just a treaty. It was a declaration that Africa's future would no longer be negotiated behind closed doors in European capitals. That sovereignty wasn't a slogan, it was a strategy. The press scrambled. Analysts blinked. The elite who had whispered in Abidjan sat in stunned silence. And then Traoré spoke. He stood on a makeshift stage in Ouagadougou, flanked by flags and flanked by fire. The crowd stretched for blocks. Students, farmers, elders, children. Some held signs. Others held silence. All held hope. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply began. They meant to contain us, he said, voice steady. To divide us. To remind us of the chains they once forged. A pause. The crowd leaned in. But we are not theirs to contain. We are not theirs to divide. And we are no longer theirs to silence. Cheers erupted. Drums pounded. Phones lit up like stars. He continued. For too long, our nations have been told we are weak alone, that we must beg for protection, that we must trade dignity for aid. He turned, gesturing to the flags of Mali and Niger. But today we say no more. We are not weak. We are united, and we will protect ourselves. The announcement was more than symbolic. The alliance included joint military operations, intelligence sharing, and a unified stance against foreign interference. It was a fortress built from shared struggle, and it was already operational. Within hours, joint patrols were reported along border zones. Military leaders from all three nations held press conferences, vowing to defend their sovereignty with one voice, one mission, one future. Social media exploded. Sahel United trended globally. TikTok flooded with edits of Traoré's speech layered over revolutionary music. Instagram stories showed murals being painted in Bamako and Niamey, Traoré's silhouette beside the words, "We rise together." Even in cities where the elite had tried to suppress his influence, youth gathered in defiance. In Dakar, students marched with signs reading, "We are not colonies." In Abidjan, graffiti appeared overnight. The summit failed. Commentators scrambled to catch up. Some called it reckless. Others called it genius. But none could deny the impact. Traoré had taken their secret plot, their quiet attempt to isolate him, and turned it into a continental crescendo. He didn't just survive their attack. He transformed it. And the elite? They were left speechless. One president, known for his long-winded speeches, canceled a press conference. Another issued a vague statement about regional cooperation that was drowned out by chants outside his palace gates. They had underestimated him. They thought he was a boy soldier with a loud voice and no plan. But Traoré had a vision, and now he had allies. In one moment, Traoré turned their secret plot into his loudest victory. The continent didn't just react, it roared. Within hours of the Alliance of Sahel States announcement, the digital world lit up. TikTok was flooded with clips of Traoré's speech, remixed with Afrobeat rhythms and revolutionary chants. Young creators stitched his words into montages of protests, murals, and flag-raising ceremonies. One video, a slow-motion shot of Traoré walking through a crowd, overlaid with the phrase "Africa is awake," hit 1 million views in under a day. Twitter was no quieter. Sahel United trended across Africa and the diaspora. Activists in Johannesburg posted side-by-side comparisons of colonial maps and the new alliance's emblem. Students in Nairobi quoted Sankara and Traoré in the same breath. In Paris, African immigrants rallied outside embassies, waving flags and chanting, "We are not your colonies." Even in cities where the elite had tried to suppress the movement, the youth pushed back. In Abidjan, graffiti bloomed overnight. The summit failed. In Dakar, university halls echoed with impromptu debates about sovereignty and solidarity. In Lagos, a mural of Traoré appeared on a crumbling wall. His eyes painted a look like they were watching everything. International media scrambled to catch up. Western outlets, slow to report the summit itself, now rushed to explain the alliance. Headlines range from cautious curiosity to outright alarm. A new axis in Africa? The Sahel bloc defies the West. Is France losing its grip? But the tone had shifted. Traoré was no longer just a young president. He was a symbol of resistance, of unity, of a continent rewriting its own story. Commentators who once dismissed him as a populist now struggled to define him. Analysts who had ignored the youth movements now called them the new voice of Africa, and the diaspora responded. In London, African artists held pop-up exhibitions titled Uncolonized. In Toronto, spoken word poets performed pieces inspired by Traoré's speeches. In New York, a panel of scholars and activists gathered to discuss the Sahel shift, and the room overflowed. It wasn't just admiration. It was validation. For decades, Africans abroad had watched their homelands through the lens of foreign policy and filtered headlines. Now they saw something different, something bold, unapologetic in theirs. And Traoré? He remained silent. No victory tour, no press blitz, just quiet movement behind the scenes. Until one morning, another announcement dropped. No speech, no warning, just a map, a new border proposal, a shared currency, a joint declaration of intent to withdraw from ECOWAS. It was his boldest move yet, and the world held its breath. The dust had settled, but the fire remained. In the weeks following the alliance's formation, Ibrahim Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't parade his victory or mock the men who had tried to silence him. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He reframed the attack. They feared our unity, he said in a quiet address broadcast across the Sahel. They feared our dignity, and they feared our refusal to kneel. His words weren't aimed at presidents or pundits. They were aimed at the youth, the millions who had watched, marched, posted, and believed. He spoke to the child in Kidal who painted flags on walls, to the student in Ouagadougou who skipped class to attend rallies, to the farmer in Talabari who tuned in on a crackling radio. This was never about me, Traoré said. It was about us, about every African who has been told to wait, to obey, to accept less. He paused, letting the silence speak. But we are done waiting. The speech wasn't fiery. It was firm, a declaration not of war, but of worth. He spoke of justice, not as a courtroom ideal, but as a lived reality. He spoke of independence, not as a flag, but as a future. And he spoke of youth, not as a demographic, but as destiny. We are the generation that will not inherit chains, he said. We will inherit courage. Across the continent, the message resonated. In classrooms, teachers played the speech as a lesson in leadership. In markets, vendors quoted it between sales. In refugee camps, it was whispered like scripture. Traoré had done more than respond to a threat. He had transformed it into a movement. And the elite? They watched, silent. Their summit had failed not because it was exposed, but because it was irrelevant. The continent had moved on, not toward chaos, but toward clarity. In Bamako, a mural appeared, 3 hands gripping each other, painted in the colors of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Beneath it, the words, "Together we rise." In Niamey, a group of young women launched a podcast titled Uncolonized, inspired by Traoré's speeches. Their first episode, "We Don't Need Permission." And in Ouagadougou, a boy stood outside the presidential palace, holding a sign that read, "I am the future, and I am not afraid." Traoré saw the sign. He smiled, because he knew the truth. Africa doesn't need permission to rise. It only needs leaders who refuse to kneel. No newspaper reported it. No headline captured it. But the truth is undeniable. Ibrahim Traoré's secret meeting didn't just shift power. It ignited a movement. From the shadows of Abidjan to the streets of Ouagadougou, a new chapter was written. Not by the old elite, but by a young leader who refused to kneel. His defiance echoed across borders, his vision stitched together nations, and his silence spoke louder than their summit. This wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a declaration of dignity, a reminder that Africa's destiny belongs to its people, not to foreign interests, not to aging regimes, and certainly not to secret meetings. You've witnessed the story they try to bury. You've seen the fire they couldn't contain. Now it's your turn. Be part of the ripple. Be part of the roar. Subscribe, share, and let the world know Africa's destiny is no longer secret. 12 men in suits thought they could erase a revolution with one meeting. They were wrong. The room was dim, the air thick with tension. Behind closed doors in Abidjan, 12 African presidents sat in silence. their faces carved with worry and pride. No cameras, no press, just whispered fears and a single, unspoken goal: stop Ibrahim Traoré before his fire spread. They called it a strategic consultation, but the truth was darker. Each man had felt the tremors, the youth rising, the flags falling, the foreign boots retreating. Traoré wasn't just a threat to their power. He was a mirror they couldn't bear to face. One leaned forward, voice low: "If we don't act now, we lose the continent." Another nodded, tapping his gold watch against the table. "He's turning our people against us, against order, against France." They spoke of sanctions, isolation, quiet pressure. Not war, not yet, but containment, a plan to suffocate the revolution before it breathed across borders. Outside, the city pulsed unaware. Inside, history was being plotted. But what none of them knew, what no intelligence report could predict, was that Traoré had already heard whispers of the meeting. And he wasn't planning to defend himself. He was planning to respond. Not with apologies, not with retreat, but with something so bold, so defiant, that would leave every man in that room scrambling to rewrite their own legacy. Because what Traoré did next wasn't just unexpected. It rewrote Africa's future. He wasn't born into power. He seized it, with conviction, not corruption. Ibrahim Traoré was just 34 when he became the youngest head of state in the world. A former artillery officer, trained in the dust and discipline of Burkina Faso's military, he didn't climb through handshakes and handouts. He rose through fire, the kind that burns in the hearts of those who've seen their people suffer too long. His ascent wasn't polished. It was raw. A coup, yes, but not for greed. For sovereignty. In a continent where foreign flags still flutter over military bases, where decisions are whispered in Paris before they're spoken in Bamako, Traoré's voice was different. He didn't ask for permission. He demanded respect. "We are not children," he said once, staring down a camera lens like it was the face of history. "We are Africans, and we will decide our own future." That sentence sent shockwaves, not just through Burkina Faso, but through every capital where leaders had grown comfortable in compromise, comfortable in silence. Because Traoré wasn't just challenging France. He was challenging the entire post-colonial order, the quiet deals, the invisible strings, the myth that Africa must always be grateful. And that terrified the elite. They called him reckless, dangerous, a destabilizer, but the youth called him something else: hope. In Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré began to appear overnight. In Dakar, chants echoed through university halls. In Kinshasa, hashtags surged. Hashtag Africa for Africans. Hashtag Traoré effect. He wasn't just a president. He was a symbol. And symbols are powerful. They don't need armies. They need belief. That's why the secret summit happened. Not because Traoré had invaded a neighbor, but because he had invaded their narrative, the one that said Africa must always kneel. This wasn't just politics. It was a battle for Africa's soul. And the men in that room knew. If they didn't stop him now, they might never stop him at all. But what they didn't realize was that Traoré had already begun building something bigger than himself. Something that no meeting, no memo, no threat could contain. They arrived in blacked-out convoys, escorted by armed guards and whispered protocol. Presidents, prime ministers, and power brokers, each one a veteran of survival, each one fluent in the language of compromise. The Abidjan summit wasn't their first secret meeting, but it was the first time they gathered in fear. Not fear of war, not fear of sanctions, fear of a young man in fatigues who refused to play their game. These were men who had mastered the art of staying in power. Some had ruled for decades, their portraits hanging in every government building, their names etched into constitutions rewritten to suit their ambitions. They wore tailored suits stitched in Paris, spoke French with colonial precision, and toasted champagne while their nations struggled to afford bread. Their ties to Western powers weren't just symbolic. They were strategic. Military aid, development loans, offshore accounts. They had built empires not on the backs of their people, but on the handshakes of foreign diplomats. And in return, they kept things quiet. predictable, profitable. But Traoré was none of those things. He didn't dine at embassies or pose for glossy magazine covers. He stood in dusty streets, surrounded by citizens who saw in him something rare, a leader who looked like them, spoke like them, and fought for them. That terrified the men in Abidjan. One had once been praised by Western media as Africa's modernizer, even as his government jailed journalists and rigged elections. Another had sent troops to suppress protests while negotiating trade deals in Brussels. A third had built a palace, so vast it required its own power grid, while hospitals in his capital ran out of medicine. They weren't just leaders. They were gatekeepers of a system designed to keep Africa dependent, divided, and docile. And Traoré threatened to burn that system down. He spoke of unity, not just among nations, but among people. He rejected foreign military bases, expelled intelligence operatives, and called out the hypocrisy of leaders who preach sovereignty while outsourcing their security. To the summit attendees, this wasn't just rebellion. It was contagion. They feared the ripple effect. That Traoré's defiance would inspire others. That youth in their own countries would start asking questions. That murals would replace portraits. That chants would drown out speeches. So they plotted. Not with tanks or troops. That'll be too obvious. They preferred quieter weapons. Diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, media manipulation. They would paint Traoré as unstable, dangerous, a threat to regional peace. They would whisper to allies, leak stories, tighten the noose. But in their arrogance, they missed something vital. Traoré wasn't playing their game. He wasn't seeking their approval. He wasn't afraid of their silence. He was building something they couldn't see because they had never looked beyond their own reflections. While they debated strategy over imported wine, Traoré was walking through villages, listening to farmers, speaking to students. While they rehearsed statements, he was rewriting the narrative. They thought they were dealing with a boy soldier. But they underestimated the fire he carried. He was born in Kera, a modest village tucked into the heart of Burkina Faso, far from presidential palaces, far from the corridors of power. Ibrahim Traoré grew up not with privilege, but with purpose. His childhood was shaped by the rhythms of rural life and the quiet dignity of a people who had endured more than they had ever been given. His father was a farmer. His mother, a teacher. They taught him that leadership wasn't about titles, it was about service. That courage wasn't loud, it was consistent. And that Africa's future wouldn't be handed down from Paris or Washington. It would be built from the ground up. Traoré excelled in school, but never sought the spotlight. He joined the military not for prestige, but for protection of his country, of his people, of the values he believed were slipping away. As an artillery officer, he saw firsthand the cost of silence. He watched foreign troops patrol African soil with impunity. He watched leaders bow to foreign interests.